January 18, 1945. Staff Sergeant Michael Brennan pressed his face into frozen mud as another artillery shell screamed overhead and detonated 30 yards behind him. The bombardment had been going for 11 minutes, precise, systematic, deadly. 300 American soldiers were pinned in an exposed valley while German artillery walked shells through their position with terrifying accuracy. Someone was directing that fire, someone who could see them. Brennan raised his head just enough to scan the distant ridgeline through his rifle scope, and there he was. A German artillery observer, binoculars raised, calling coordinates into a radio. Brennan had been trained to wait for orders before engaging priority targets. But as another shell killed 2 men in the foxhole beside him, Brennan made a calculation. 1 shot to save 300 lives. He steadied his breathing, found his aim, and pulled the trigger. This is the story of how one sniper stopped an artillery barrage by breaking protocol and why command never officially acknowledged what he did. Before we continue, if you want to hear the untold stories of World War II soldiers who saved lives by breaking rules, hit subscribe. These stories don't appear in the official histories. The valley shouldn't have been a death trap. On paper, it was a defensive position. High ground on 3 sides, a narrow approach from the south, good fields of fire for American infantry. The 99th Infantry Division had occupied it 2 days earlier during their push toward the Siegfried Line, and intelligence had assured them the position was secure. Intelligence was wrong. German artillery batteries had been positioned in the hills to the east, camouflaged and silent, waiting for exactly this opportunity. When the Americans settled into the valley, the Germans didn't fire immediately. They waited. They watched. And when the moment was right, they opened up with a precision that only came from one source: direct observation. Artillery is a mathematics problem. You calculate distance, elevation, wind, and target coordinates. But those calculations are only as good as your information. Fire blindly, and you waste ammunition hitting empty ground. Fire with visual confirmation from an observer who can see the target and call corrections in real time, and every shell becomes a surgical strike. The German observer had that visual confirmation, and he was very good at his job. Brennan had been with the 99th for 6 months, attached as a sniper after training at Fort Benning. Before the war, he'd been a surveyor in Colorado, working in the mountains, calculating distances and angles for construction projects. The Army had recognized that skill set and turned him into a precision shooter. He understood trajectories, windage, elevation. He understood patience. But nothing in his training had prepared him for this. The first shell landed at 8:47 hours. It struck the western edge of the valley, away from most of the American positions. A ranging shot, testing the distance. Brennan barely registered it. Artillery fire was common on the front lines. You learned to ignore it unless it was landing close. The second shell landed 90 seconds later, 50 meters closer to the American positions. Another correction. The observer was walking the fire in, methodically closing the distance. The third shell killed 4 men. That's when Brennan understood. This wasn't random harassment fire. This was directed artillery. Someone was watching them, calling adjustments, walking shells directly into American positions with terrifying precision. He grabbed his rifle and scanned the surrounding ridges. Artillery observers positioned themselves where they could see the target area clearly. High ground, good sight lines, usually protected by distance and terrain. The German guns were firing from the east, which meant the observer would be somewhere on the eastern ridges, elevated enough to see into the valley. Another shell screamed in. This one landed in the center of the American position, directly on a foxhole. The explosion sent dirt and debris skyward. Brennan didn't look to see if anyone survived. He kept scanning through his scope, methodically sweeping the ridgeline. There were patterns to this. German artillery doctrine emphasized the use of forward observers. They worked in pairs usually, one with binoculars for observation, one with a radio for communication. They positioned themselves 800 to 1,000 meters from the target, close enough for clear observation, far enough to avoid small arms fire. Brennan knew all of this. He'd studied German tactics during training. He'd read captured field manuals. He understood their methodology. But understanding and stopping were two different things. Another shell, another explosion, more screams. The American position was starting to panic. Soldiers were abandoning foxholes, trying to retreat south, the only direction not covered by artillery. But movement made them easier targets. The observer could see them running. Brennan's spotter, a young private named Danny Chen, crawled up beside him. "We need to move, Sergeant. They're going to kill everyone in this valley." "They've got an observer," Brennan said, not taking his eye from the scope. "Directing fire. Until we find him, moving doesn't matter. They'll just follow us." "Can you see him?" "Working on it." Brennan continued his sweep. The eastern ridge was maybe 800 yards away. Tree line along the crest. Several rocky outcroppings that would provide good cover. If he were positioning an observer, he'd pick the northern outcropping. Best angle into the valley. Natural concealment. Protected approach from the reverse slope. He focused his scope on that position and waited. Artillery observers didn't stay hidden constantly. They had to expose themselves to observe, to use their binoculars, to see the results of their fire corrections. It was a rhythm. Watch, correct, duck, watch, correct, duck. Another shell landed. This one was even more precise, striking an ammunition storage point that someone had poorly concealed. The secondary explosion was massive. Brennan estimated at least a dozen casualties from that one impact. 300 men in this valley, casualties mounting every 90 seconds. If this continued, the entire position would be destroyed within the hour. Brennan steadied his breathing and watched the outcropping. 30 seconds passed. Nothing. Another shell screamed overhead, landed near the southern edge. The observer was now bracketing the entire valley, ensuring no one could escape without being targeted. 45 seconds. Still nothing on the ridge. Chen crawled closer. "Sergeant, Battalion is calling for withdrawal. We need to—" "Wait." Brennan saw movement, just a flicker. Someone raising binoculars. There. Northern outcropping. Exactly where he'd predicted. The observer rose slightly from cover, scanning the valley through his optics, assessing the damage from the last shell. Brennan could see him clearly now. German uniform, binoculars. Radio operator crouched beside him, holding the communication equipment. The observer was calling another correction, probably adjusting fire to hit the retreating soldiers. The range was 820 yards. Brennan had made longer shots in training, but never under these conditions, never with this much at stake. His training screamed at him to follow protocol. Snipers were required to request authorization before engaging targets beyond defensive range. The process was simple. Identify the target, call it in through the chain of command, wait for approval, engage only after receiving confirmation. But following that process would take minutes. Maybe 10, maybe 15, depending on how quickly the request moved through channels. And in 10 minutes, dozens more men would die. Brennan watched another shell land, watched it kill 3 more soldiers who'd been trying to help a wounded man. Watched the observer calmly adjust his binoculars and call another correction. The math was simple. 1 German observer directing artillery versus 300 American soldiers trapped in a kill zone. Remove the observer, the artillery goes blind. Blind artillery stops killing effectively. Brennan made his decision. He would fire without authorization, he would violate protocol, and he would deal with the consequences later, assuming he survived to face them. Brennan understood artillery observers because he'd been taught to think like them. During sniper training at Fort Benning, instructors had emphasized knowing the enemy's role in the larger system. An artillery observer wasn't just another soldier. He was the critical link between eyes and guns. Without him, artillery batteries fired blind, wasting ammunition on empty ground or outdated coordinates. With him, every shell became a precision instrument. The German doctrine was straightforward. Position observers where they could see the target area clearly. Equip them with quality optics and reliable radio communication. Train them to call corrections quickly and accurately. The result was artillery that could destroy specific targets rather than just saturate areas. American doctrine was similar in theory but different in practice. American observers operated closer to the front lines, often embedded with forward units. German observers maintained distance, using superior optics to compensate. 800 to 1,000 meters was standard, far enough to avoid rifle fire, close enough for clear observation. Brennan had killed German soldiers before, machine gunners, infantry, even one officer who'd been foolish enough to stand exposed while giving orders. But he'd never targeted an artillery observer, not because they were protected by some unspoken rule, but because the opportunity rarely presented itself. Observers were careful. They stayed hidden. They exposed themselves only when necessary. This one had been exposed for almost 30 seconds now, calmly calling corrections while shells destroyed the valley below. His confidence came from distance. 800 yards felt safe. American rifles were effective to maybe 400 yards for most soldiers. Sniper rifles extended that range, but even then, 800 yards required exceptional skill and perfect conditions. Brennan studied the target through his scope. The observer was positioned behind a rocky outcropping, using the natural terrain as a shield. Only his head and shoulders were visible when he rose to use his binoculars. The radio operator stayed lower, completely concealed, except for the antenna extending above the rocks. The wind was the first problem. At 800 yards, wind drift became significant. Brennan watched the trees between his position and the ridge, looking for movement in the branches. Light wind, maybe 5 miles per hour, left to right. That meant his bullet would drift right. He'd need to aim slightly left to compensate. The second problem was elevation. The observer was higher than Brennan's position. The bullet would drop over that distance, but less than it would on level ground. Brennan estimated the elevation difference at roughly 60 feet. He adjusted his mental calculation. The third problem was time. The observer wasn't staying exposed continuously. He'd rise, observe, call a correction, then duck back behind cover while waiting for the next shell to land. The pattern was predictable, but the window was short. Maybe 20 seconds of exposure, then 40 seconds, hidden. Brennan would have one chance per cycle. Another shell screamed overhead. This one landed near the medical station that had been hastily set up in a protected depression. The explosion sent medical supplies scattering. Brennan didn't see if the medic survived. Chen shifted nervously beside him. "Sergeant, if you're going to take that shot, it needs to be now. Battalion's ordering full retreat in 5 minutes." "Retreat into what? That observer can see the southern approach. The moment everyone starts moving that direction, he'll call fire on the retreat route. It'll be a massacre." "So what do we do?" "I remove the observer." "Without authorization?" Brennan didn't answer. He was watching the pattern. The observer had ducked down again after the last correction. 40 seconds until he'd rise to observe the results. Brennan settled into position, finding his breathing rhythm. Slow inhale, slow exhale, heart rate steady. He'd made shots like this on the range. Targets at 800 yards weren't impossible. They just required perfect execution. But range targets didn't move. Range targets didn't duck behind cover. Range targets didn't have 300 lives depending on whether the shot connected. Brennan pushed those thoughts away. Doubt killed accuracy. He focused on the mechanics: wind compensation, elevation adjustment, breathing control, trigger squeeze, 30 seconds. The observer rose into view, binoculars raised, scanning the valley. Brennan watched him through the scope. The German was young, maybe early 20s. Methodical in his movements, professional. He was doing his job and doing it well. Brennan placed the crosshairs slightly left of center mass, compensating for wind drift. He elevated the aim point to account for distance and angle. His finger rested lightly on the trigger. The observer lowered his binoculars and reached for the radio handset. He was calling another correction. Another shell would launch in approximately 60 seconds. Another impact, more casualties. Brennan exhaled slowly and began the trigger squeeze. Smooth, steady pressure. No jerking, no anticipation. Just gradual compression until the rifle fired. The shot broke clean. The rifle recoiled. Through the scope, Brennan watched the bullet's flight seem instantaneous, despite the actual time of travel being just over a second. The observer dropped. No dramatic fall. Just sudden collapse. The binoculars tumbled from his hands. The radio operator beside him froze, shocked, not understanding what had happened. Then silence. No more corrections being called. No more precise adjustments. And 90 seconds later, when the next German artillery shell landed, it hit 400 meters north of the American position. Blind fire. The guns were shooting at remembered coordinates without real-time observation. The following shell landed even farther off target. Chen stared at Brennan. "Did you just get ready to move? There might be a backup observer." But Brennan already knew there wasn't. The German artillery pattern had changed from surgical to random. They were firing blind now, hoping to hit something through volume rather than precision. The bombardment that had been systematically destroying 300 men had just become ineffective background noise. The German artillery continued firing, but the precision was gone. Shells landed randomly across the valley, some overshooting by hundreds of meters, others falling short. The guns were shooting at coordinates that were minutes old, trying to hit targets that had already moved. Without real-time observation, artillery became guesswork. Brennan kept his scope trained on the ridge where the observer had fallen. The radio operator had disappeared completely, probably retreating down the reverse slope to report what had happened. Smart. Staying exposed after your observer got killed was suicide. Around the valley, American soldiers began to realize something had changed. The methodical destruction had stopped. The shells were still coming, but they were missing. Men started moving again, helping wounded, reorganizing positions. The panic that had been building for 11 minutes began to ease. Chen lowered his binoculars and looked at Brennan with something between awe and confusion. "How did you know that would work?" "I didn't." Brennan chambered another round, still scanning. But the math made sense. Observer dies, artillery goes blind. Blind artillery stops being effective. "You just saved everyone in this valley." Brennan didn't respond. He was searching for backup observers. German doctrine sometimes positioned secondary observers as redundancy. If one team got hit, another could take over. But as minutes passed and the artillery remained wild and uncoordinated, Brennan concluded there was no backup. The Germans had relied on a single observation post. That was their mistake. Across the valley, an officer Brennan didn't recognize was organizing the withdrawal. Men moved south in controlled groups, taking advantage of the artillery's newfound blindness. The shells still fell, but they were hitting empty ground now, wasted explosives with no observer to correct them. Within 15 minutes, the valley was clear. 300 soldiers evacuated with minimal additional casualties. The position they left behind was cratered and burning, but most of the men who'd been trapped there were alive. They'd lived to fight another day because one German with binoculars had stopped directing the guns. Brennan and Chen were among the last to leave. They moved carefully, using terrain and smoke for concealment, just in case another observer was watching. But no concentrated fire followed them. The Germans had gone truly blind. As they reached the assembly point south of the valley, Brennan noticed soldiers staring at him. Word had spread somehow. Someone had seen the shot. Someone had put together that the artillery stopped precisely when Brennan fired. The looks weren't quite gratitude, more like uncertain respect mixed with questions nobody was asking out loud. Chen broke the silence. "Sergeant, what do we tell Battalion about the unauthorized engagement?" Brennan considered lying, saying the observer was hit by random fire or that he'd requested authorization and received it. But lies had a way of unraveling, especially when 300 witnesses had just survived something they shouldn't have. "We tell them the truth. I saw a target. I made a calculation. I took the shot. They're going to ask why you didn't wait for authorization." "They are. What will you say?" Brennan looked back at the valley, still being pounded by blind artillery fire that was hitting nothing. He thought about the men who died in those first 11 minutes. He thought about the hundreds who would have died if the bombardment had continued. "I'll say I did the math. One German dies, 300 Americans live, and I'll ask them which math they prefer." Chen nodded slowly. "Think they'll understand?" "No idea." Brennan slung his rifle. but I can live with the consequences better than I could have lived with watching everyone die while I waited for permission. They rejoined their unit in silence. Within the hour, Brennan received a summons. Battalion headquarters wanted to speak with him immediately. The questions were about to begin. Battalion headquarters occupied a farmhouse 3 miles behind the front line. Brennan arrived with his rifle still slung, boots covered in mud from the valley. A corporal directed him to a room where Major William Garrett sat behind a makeshift desk, studying a field report. Garrett didn't look up immediately. He finished reading, set the paper down, and finally met Brennan's eyes. Staff Sergeant Brennan, you engaged a target at approximately 08:58 hours this morning, 820 yards, 1 shot. Target was a German artillery observer. Yes, sir. Did you request authorization for that engagement? No, sir. Garrett leaned back in his chair. Protocol requires snipers to request authorization before engaging targets beyond defensive range. You're aware of this protocol? Yes, sir. Then explain why you violated it. Brennan kept his voice level, factual. The target was directing artillery fire that was destroying our position. 300 men were pinned in the valley. Casualties were mounting every 90 seconds. Requesting authorization would have taken 10 to 15 minutes. In that time, I estimated 40 to 60 additional casualties. I made a tactical calculation that removing the observer immediately would save more lives than following protocol. You made a tactical calculation. Garrett's tone was neutral, unreadable. That's not your job, Sergeant. Your job is to follow orders and engage authorized targets. Yes, sir. And yet you decided your judgment superseded the chain of command. Brennan met the major's eyes. I decided that 1 German observer was worth less than 300 American soldiers. If that's wrong, sir, then I'm wrong. But those 300 men are alive because that observer is dead. The room fell silent. Garrett picked up another paper, scanned it. Captain Morrison witnessed your shot. He states that artillery fire became immediately ineffective after the observer was eliminated. He also states that without your intervention, the position would have been completely destroyed within 30 minutes. I can't confirm the timeline, sir, but the artillery stopped being accurate after the observer went down. Because you killed their eyes. Yes, sir. Garrett set the paper down and stood, walking to the window. Outside, soldiers moved equipment and supplies, normal operations continuing while men debated whether saving lives without permission constituted misconduct. Sergeant Brennan, you put me in a difficult position. If I commend your action, I'm endorsing unauthorized engagements. Every sniper in this division will think they can make their own tactical decisions without oversight. But if I reprimand you, I'm punishing a man who saved 300 lives through sound tactical judgment. Brennan said nothing. Garrett turned from the window. The official record will state that you engaged a high-priority target that posed an immediate threat to American forces. No mention of authorization protocols will appear in the report. Unofficially, you're receiving a commendation for exceptional marksmanship under combat conditions. Sir, I know what you were trying to do. You were trying to stop your friends from dying. Garrett's expression softened slightly. That's commendable. It's also dangerous if every soldier starts deciding which orders to follow. So officially, this conversation never happened. You followed protocol, eliminated a legitimate target, and saved lives. Understood? Yes, sir. Dismissed. Brennan saluted and turned to leave. Sergeant, Garrett's voice stopped him at the door. That was an exceptional shot, 820 yards in combat conditions. Where'd you learn to shoot like that? Colorado, sir. Surveying in the mountains. Learned to calculate distance and angles. The Army just taught me to apply it differently. Garrett nodded. Well, keep applying it. But next time, at least pretend to request authorization first. Brennan allowed himself a small smile. Yes, sir. He walked out of headquarters knowing he'd been simultaneously praised and warned. The Army had found its compromise. His action would be acknowledged quietly, but never officially celebrated. 300 men lived, and the paperwork would make it look like everything happened by the book. Sometimes that was the best outcome you could hope for. Brennan returned to his unit expecting questions, maybe resentment from soldiers who thought he'd taken an unnecessary risk. Instead, he found quiet respect. Men nodded as he passed. A few mumbled thanks. One corporal from the valley approached him directly. "Sergeant, I was in the foxhole that got hit right before the artillery stopped. Lost my best friend. But I'm alive because you took that shot." The corporal paused. "Just wanted you to know." Brennan didn't know how to respond. "I'm sorry about your friend." "Yeah, me too." The corporal walked away. Chen found Brennan cleaning his rifle that evening. Word spreading. Other sniper teams are asking about observer targeting. They want to know how you calculated the shot. It's not complicated. Find the observer, remove the observer, artillery goes blind. Basic tactics. Not according to the manual. Manual says officers first, then machine gunners, then radio operators. Observers are listed as secondary targets. The manual's wrong. Brennan inspected the rifle barrel, satisfied with the cleaning. Observers multiply force. One observer directing artillery is worth more than 10 officers giving orders. Kill the multiplier, you reduce the threat exponentially. Chen pulled out a small notebook. "Can you explain that again? Slower? Because half the snipers in this division are going to start hunting observers if they understand why it works." Brennan set down his rifle and thought about how to explain it. Artillery without observation is area denial. You know shells are landing somewhere, so you avoid that area. But artillery with observation is precision destruction. The observer sees you, calls your exact position, and the guns kill you specifically. Remove observation, and precision artillery becomes area artillery, still dangerous, but survivable. So observers are force multipliers. Exactly, and force multipliers should be priority targets. Chen wrote that down. You think doctrine will change? Eventually, maybe. The Army's slow to update manuals. Brennan reassembled his rifle. But snipers talk to each other. What works spreads faster than what's written. 2 days later, another sniper team from the 2nd Division reported eliminating a German artillery observer. The artillery barrage that had been hitting their position stopped immediately. The report went through channels, and this time, the sniper had requested authorization first. It was granted. The pattern repeated across the front. Snipers started actively hunting artillery observers instead of waiting for them to appear incidentally. German artillery effectiveness decreased noticeably in sectors where American sniper teams operated aggressively. German forces adapted. Observers began working in shifts, reducing their exposure time. They positioned themselves farther back, using better concealment. Some used decoys, mannequins with binoculars positioned to draw sniper fire, while the real observer worked from a different location. But the damage was done. The American sniper community had learned that observers were high-value targets worth prioritizing. The doctrine hadn't officially changed, but field practice had evolved beyond what the manuals taught. Brennan participated in 3 more observer eliminations over the following weeks. Each time, he requested authorization first. Each time, it was granted immediately. The system had learned even if the paperwork hadn't caught up. In late February, Brennan received new orders. He was being reassigned to a training unit in England to teach advanced sniper tactics to replacement troops. Someone in command had decided his experience was more valuable in a classroom than on the front line. Chen seemed disappointed. "They're pulling you off the line because you're too effective?" "They're pulling me off the line because I know something worth teaching." Brennan packed his gear methodically. 3 months of training snipers will multiply my impact more than 3 months of shooting Germans myself. You going to teach them about observers? First thing on the syllabus. Before leaving for England, Brennan wrote a detailed report on artillery observer targeting. He included range calculations, exposure pattern analysis, tactical priorities, and the mathematical justification for why observers should be considered high-priority targets. The report was 23 pages, technical and precise. He submitted it through official channels, knowing it would probably sit in a file somewhere, unread and ignored. But he also made 5 copies and distributed them quietly to sniper team leaders across the division. Those copies got read, they got discussed, and most importantly, they got used. If this story showed you a side of World War II you've never heard, subscribe for more, because the practical lessons that saved lives rarely made it into the history books. By March 1945, artillery observer targeting had become standard practice among American sniper teams, even though official doctrine still listed them as secondary priorities. The gap between what was written and what was practiced continued to widen. Field experience had proven that some targets mattered more than the manual admitted. Brennan spent the rest of the war in England, training snipers who would never know that the tactics they learned came from one unauthorized shot on a frozen January morning. He taught them mathematics, wine calculation, breathing control, and target prioritization. He taught them that artillery observers were force multipliers worth more dead than most officers. He never told them about the 300 men in the valley. That story stayed between him and the soldiers who'd been there. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Michael Brennan was still in England when the announcement came, teaching his fourth class of replacement snipers who would never see combat. The students celebrated. Brennan felt mostly relief. He'd survived. The mathematics had worked in his favor. The Army discharged him in August. No special ceremony. Just standard paperwork, a train ticket to Colorado, and a rifle qualification badge that didn't mention artillery observers or unauthorized shots or 300 lives saved on a frozen January morning. Brennan returned to Denver and went back to surveying. The skills that had made him a sniper translated well, calculating distances, measuring angles, understanding terrain. He worked for a construction company that was building highways through the mountains. Quiet work, precise work. Work where the math mattered, but nobody died if you made a mistake. People asked about the war sometimes. Brennan's answers were brief. Sniper, European theater, came home. He didn't elaborate. Most veterans didn't. The ones who'd actually seen combat talked about it the least. He married in 1947, a woman named Catherine who worked at the county courthouse. They had 2 sons and a daughter, built a small house in Lakewood with money saved from surveying work, lived quietly, raised kids, fixed things that broke. The rifle stayed in the closet. Brennan never hunted. Catherine asked him about it once. After the war, I just didn't see the point, he said. That was the truth, or close enough. Killing for food felt different than killing to stop artillery, but putting crosshairs on anything living reminded him of things he preferred not to remember. In 1953, a letter arrived from the Department of the Army. They were updating field manuals based on combat lessons from World War II and Korea. Someone had found Brennan's observer targeting report in the archives. Would he be willing to consult on the revision? Brennan wrote back declining. I was just a sergeant who took a shot. Plenty of others did the same. They don't need me to write doctrine. But the doctrine changed anyway. The new manual listed artillery observers as priority targets, equal to officers and radio operators. The mathematical justification Brennan had written in 1945 appeared almost word for word in the revised text, uncredited. Somewhere, quietly, the lesson had been absorbed. Brennan never told his family about the valley, never mentioned the 300 soldiers or the 800-yard shot or the choice between protocol and survival. It didn't seem relevant to highway construction or raising children or the ordinary challenges of civilian life. In 1967, his oldest son came home from college with questions about Vietnam. Dad, you were a sniper, right? Did you ever have to make hard choices about who to shoot? Brennan thought about that question for a long time. Finally, he said, every choice is hard. You just do the math and hope you're right. His son didn't understand. That was fine. Some things couldn't be explained to people who hadn't been there. Michael Brennan died in 1989 at the age of 67. Heart failure, quick and painless. His obituary mentioned he was a World War II veteran and a retired surveyor. Nothing about sniping, nothing about saving lives. At the funeral, an old man approached Catherine. He introduced himself as Danny Chen, Brennan's wartime spotter. He'd traveled from California just to pay respects. Your husband never talked about the war, did he? Chen asked. Almost never. Chen nodded. That's because he was too busy being humble about saving 300 lives in one morning. January 18th, 1945. One shot. Changed everything. Catherine listened as Chen explained. About the valley, about the artillery, about the choice Brennan made when protocol said to wait and mathematics said to shoot. After Chen left, Catherine went through Brennan's belongings. She found the rifle in the closet, still perfectly maintained despite never being fired. And beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth, she found a small field notebook. Inside, one page had a single entry. January 18th, 1945. Range, 820 yards. Wind, 5 beneath left to right. One shot, observer down. Artillery stopped. Math worked. That was the only record Michael Brennan kept of the day he saved 300 lives by breaking the rules. The official Army history of World War II mentions that American sniper tactics evolved during the European campaign to prioritize artillery observers as high-value targets. The practice significantly reduced German artillery effectiveness in the final months of the war. The history doesn't mention names, it doesn't record the specific shots or the soldiers who took them. It just notes that doctrine changed because field experience proved observers mattered more than the manual admitted. Michael Brennan never appeared in those histories. He was just a surveyor from Colorado who'd done some mathematics under pressure and made a shot when it counted. He wouldn't have wanted it any other way. Sometimes the most important shots are the ones nobody celebrates. Sometimes saving lives means breaking rules, and sometimes the best soldiers are the ones who understand that courage isn't about following orders. It's about knowing when the math matters more than the manual.